In the last lecture, we completed our survey of the events symbolized by the imagery of the seals, and in the consideration of the seventh seal, we were introduced to the 7 trumpets. That is to say, we found the events of the 7th seal to consist of the sounding of 7 trumpets by 7 angels, and the events ensuing upon those soundings. The 7th seal consists of the multitudinous details connected with the sounding of the 7 trumpets. Tonight it will be our duty to look at the things represented by the trumpets. The common run of people laugh when we talk of the seals and trumpets and vials, and the uncommon run of people too. The respectable and the learned take part in the jest. Their mirth is entirely misplaced. Granted that these terms are so much jargon to the generality, their uncouthness is due not to the subject itself, but to the general non-acquaintance of the people with them. They are the technicalities of the most advanced chapter in the Bible. The technicalities of any subject are barbarous to those who are not acquainted with them, but to make them the ground of scorn is an aggravation of ignorance. It reminds us of the words of Solomon. Wisdom is too high for a fool. The Apocalypse is a great deep. There is a wisdom and beauty in it that impart an ecstasy of admiration when the mind opens to them. It is not only imparts of the knowledge of the future, but it does so in a system of symbolism that is symmetrical in structure, complete in plan, distinct and vigorous in detail, and perfect in the appropriateness of its figures. This is not obvious all at once. It is not obvious at all to those who are ignorant of the first principles of divine truth, as revealed in the writings of Moses and the prophets, interpreted in harmony with the apostles, and even to those who know the truth. It is dark for a while. Only after patient study of the book of God for a long time, the excellence of the Apocalypse is appreciated. For a time, the matter of the Apocalypse seems wild, austere, high, hard, perhaps inscrutable, something unpractical, something not useful. Such impressions are due to spiritual infancy. Men ought to condemn themselves for such feelings. They ought to be very modest. They ought to assume, even if not able to perceive, that the Apocalypse must be wise and useful, because an emanation of the divine mind. We must not set ourselves up as the standard of judgment. We're all fools to start with, if not to finish with. The first step in true progress is to know that we are ignorant. There is hope when we realize this. But seest thou a man wise in his own conceit? Solomon says, there is more hope of a fool than of him. When we start with a right idea of ourselves, we shall be as little children as Jesus prescribes. We shall not measure everything by our impressions and conceptions. We shall not set ourselves up as the standard. We shall recognize that there must be things as much higher than our conceptions as heaven is higher than our puny stature of 5 or 6 feet. Recognizing this, we shall be prepared to ask what they are, if we can know them, and receive them in humility, however hard of apprehension, instead of scornfully rejecting them because they are higher than ourselves. This is a long step in the direction of wisdom, to know that we are small and know nothing. Any other attitude is the attitude of fools, and it is written that God taketh no pleasure in fools. God is wise, as manifest in our own mechanism and in all nature around. Because the apocalypse is his, it bears the impression of his wisdom, which, however hard to receive at first, becomes a cause of joy and thanksgiving. We have looked at the significance of the seals. We found a scroll introduced, sealed with 7 seals, as illustrating the concealment in the mind of God of certain knowledge of future events affecting Christ and his people. We found that Jesus was alone esteemed worthy to unloose those seals, or obtain access to that knowledge, the impartation of which by the Father to him qualified him to carry out the program written in the symbolic scroll. We have seen him break seal after seal, or exhibit one after the other the events destined to occur in the various periods covered by the seals. We have come to the 7th and find the figure changed. It is no longer a mere disclosing of what course affairs would take in the Roman Empire as affecting Christ and his brethren. It is a blowing of trumpets to summon events, so to speak, to bring judgments on the scene. We all know what a trumpet blast is, and for what it is used. It is mostly an instrument of military use, to direct the movements of large bodies of men who could not otherwise be made aware of the will of the commander. Such an instrument, when used as a figure, must mean the urgent causing of unpeaceful events. The Apocalypse is not the first place in the Bible where the figure is used in this sense. Thus we read in Jeremiah 4 verse 5, "Blow ye the trumpet in the land, cry, gather together and say, Assemble yourselves, and let us go into the defenced cities." Again, Hosea 8 verse 1, "Set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant." Again, Joel 2 verse 1, "Blow ye the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain." Doubtless these allusions to the blowing of the trumpet originated in the use of trumpets in the convoking of the assembly of Israel in the wilderness, as they came out of the land of Egypt, in the monthly blowing of trumpets at the new moons, as enjoined. Still they exemplify a figurative use which finds its boldest illustration in the 7 trumpets blown by the 7 angels of the 7th seal. But what was their calling for a different style of symbolism from the seals? The contemplation of the events of the 6th seal will supply the answer to this question. There was an entire change in the situation. Up to that time, paganism was on the throne of the world, and the Roman Empire an empire of idolatry in consequence. Now, concerning nations in that position, it is written that God had suffered them to walk in their own ways, Acts 14, verse 16, on the principle that to whom little is given, little is required, and that the ground of condemnation is divine relation and responsibility, Amos 3, verse 2. Nations, like men, though in honour, if they have no understanding, are as the beasts that perish, Psalm 49, verse 20. This was the relation of the Roman polity to the divine law under the pagan Caesars. Rome was the political incorporation of the ignorance that is natural to man in relation to all divine things. But there was a change when Constantine came to the throne, and when the state was organically allied with the profession of the name of Christ. The friends of Christ for a time found themselves under the shadow of the throne. The Scriptures were accepted as the law of the state. A new order of things arose with the name of God written upon it, so far as professed subjection was concerned. It was therefore natural that with such a change in the constitution of things in the world, there should be a change in the symbolism expressive of its divine relations. It was appropriate, too, that the new symbolism should be representative of a higher degree of responsibility than attached to pagan Rome. The trumpets certainly were so. They intimated a direct bringing or causing of judgments on the Roman body politic in its new relation, on account of its wrongdoings against Christ, instead of merely an unfolding by seal-breaking of things that were to come. The use of the trumpets is related to judgment. Of this we have already looked at some illustrations from the prophets. It finds a rudimentary type in the destruction of Jericho. In fact, the scheme of the Apocalypse would seem to find a foreshadowing in the mode adopted to bring that destruction about. The Israelites were to march round it 7 days, the priests blowing trumpets of ram's horns as they marched. On the 7th day they were to march round the city 7 times, after which the city should fall into their hands. A certain analogy will be perceived between this and the 7 seals, the last of which contains the 7 trumpets, the last of which again contains the 7 vials, and the last of these the 7 thunders, as the result of all of which Babylon falls, and the world comes into the hands of Christ and his brethren. The Bible abounds with beautiful analogies, and this seems to be one of them. We're introduced to the sounding of the trumpets in verse 7, chapter 8. Verse 6 informs us that the angels who received the 7 trumpets on the opening of the 7th seal prepared themselves to sound. A careless reading would pass this over, but by the hand of Dr. Thomas, God has taught us to read the Apocalypse with carefulness instead of carelessness. There is nothing superfluous in the wording, nothing put in to fill up. There is a meaning to everything. The preparation to sound has a meaning. There was, in point of fact, a period of providential preparation for the judgment events of the trumpets. Each of the trumpets brought invaders upon some part of the Roman Empire. So exactly appropriate was the use of the trumpet to this part of Roman history. The trumpet summoning armies to move. There was a preparation for these invasions, an opening of the way to the invaders. These invaders in the first instance were mostly the barbarians who occupied the northern parts of Europe. The way had to be paved for their incursions and for their ultimate triumph over the military discipline of Rome. This occurred during the reign of Jovian, successor to Julian, who came first after Constantine. The Roman Empire was confined to the south of the river Danube. The territory to the north of that river was as little known to the Romans then as Central Africa is to us. The most that was known was that it was occupied by fierce and warlike tribes, whose barbarism and want of discipline, however, rendered them somewhat powerless. From these causes they were for centuries easily kept at bay. But a change came when the time arrived to prepare for the judicial trumpets. This change occurred in its most marked form during the reign of Jovian, just before the commencement of the trumpets, a reign that we must consider as the preparation period of verse 6. It originated in a struggle that took place between 2 of the barbarian races, the Goths and the Huns. In this struggle, the Huns obtained the advantage, and the Goths, being hard-pressed, asked permission of the Roman generals to cross to the southern side of the Danube, to escape from the molestations of their successful enemies. The Roman generals consented, and the Gothic nation came over and settled in Illyricum, a district corresponding to modern Bosnia and Herzegovina, of which the world has recently heard so much. This was the beginning of the trumpet visitations, or rather the preparation for them. The Romans no longer had the Danube as a barrier between them and the barbarians. The barbarians were in their midst, so to speak. The Goths grew numerous and formidable. To avert the danger of their presence, the Romans decided to take them into their pay as military auxiliaries. This gave them arms and money and taught them the art of war, and used them as an addition to the Roman army. The measure, which was intended to make them harmless and allies, had the opposite effect. It converted them into a formidable foe. The Goths gradually woke to a sense of their power, and as the hour was approaching for the blast of the first trumpet, the Goths were getting into position for the work they had to do in obedience to its summons. The first trumpet. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. Just realize the scene. After a getting ready pause, a clarion blast breaks upon the stillness of the air. When the notes die away, there is a descent of hail, and you observe the forked lightning gleam and hiss here and there in its midst, and on the ground you see streamlets of blood and scorched vegetation. This is a striking piece of symbolism. Let us glance at the events symbolized. You will observe that the hail and fire were said to be cast upon the earth. That this was the Roman jurisdiction we have already seen under the seals. There is nothing strange in limiting the earth to the Roman Empire. It was the seat of civilization, outside of which all was social waste and desert. It was the arena upon which the Spirit of God was developing in its work by the gospel. Therefore it was natural to speak of it as the earth, or habitable, in contrast with the regions and countries outside of it, from which came the elements of the judgments brought on Rome by the trumpets. You will observe, however, that only a third part of the earth was affected by the trumpet. This ought to read, the third, which gives the key to what is puzzling at first. In the period to which it refers, the three sons of Constantine divided the Roman world among them, the eastern, the western, and the central. Thus the Roman Empire was in three parts. The central third was the third, the Roman third peculiarly, because comprising the seat of government. Upon this, then, our attention is fixed as the part of the empire to be affected by the hail and the fire. What came as a matter of fact? In answer to this, we look at the barbarians admitted to the south of the Danube. There were the Goths escaping from the Huns. But the Huns and the Goths became friendly, and the Huns wanted to emigrate southwards as well. They applied for the permission of the Romans. The Romans refused, but the Huns came without their consent and added a new swarm of very dangerous neighbours to those already too near them. The Goths, nurtured by the Romans and perceiving the growing weakness of their masters, became exacting in their demands. They wanted more pay and privileges than the emperor could consent to, and his refusal was the letting loose of the judgment events of the first trumpet. War broke out between the Romans and the Goths. A series of battles were fought, in which the Romans were worsted, and the emperor himself finally slain. The result was the establishment of Gothic independence under a chief who became their king, Alaric, a barbarian of fierce nature and considerable military talents. By and by this Alaric felt his strength and resolved, without the delays and circumlocutions of diplomacy, to lay the greatness of Rome in the dust. He assembled a large army of disciplined barbarians and marched for the northern entrance of Italy. Prior to passing into Italy itself, he went westward and ravaged the beautiful provinces, owing allegiance to Rome in that direction. The hail and the fire did their work effectually. The banks of the Rhine, which were crowned with elegant houses and well-cultivated farms, were laid waste. Suddenly, without warning to the unsuspecting inhabitants, the scene of peace and plenty was changed into a desert, and wide, prosperous districts in an instant became smoking solitudes. 17 provinces of Gaul were subjected to this devastation. In 2 years, the horde of barbarians, increasing in violence by new accessions, swept over and desolated the whole of the country lying between the Alps, the ocean, and the Pyrenees. They drove the inhabitants before them in frightened crowds everywhere, that is, such as could escape their ruthless swords, carrying with them as much as they could rescue from the wreck of their houses and churches. In AD 408, Alaric turned his march towards Rome itself. He passed the Alps and the Po, and proceeding along the eastern seacoast of Italy, made an easy prey of many cities, which he gave over to the pillage of his soldiers. Arrived before Rome, he commenced siege operations against a city which had been the unquestionable mistress of the world for ages, and had never been dishonoured by the presence of a foreign enemy. The experience of Jerusalem at the hands of Rome 4 centuries previous was now returned upon Rome's own head. Famine prevailed in the city. Hunger dissolved the restraints of law and order. They murdered one another and devoured the bodies of their victims. Even mothers ate their slaughtered infants. Many thousands of the inhabitants expired in the streets and in their own houses for want of food, and the stench arising from their unburied bodies revived the scenes of Jerusalem. At length, Alaric accepted an enormous sum of money to retire, but it was only for a short time. The negotiations for peace fell through, and Alaric returned, and another siege followed with increasing horrors, and a third in the next year. In the third siege the Goths obtained admission, and the city was given up to pillage. In 6 days the Goths marched southward and carried fire and sword into the southern provinces of Italy. While so engaged, Alaric died, and the fire and hail mingled with blood had expended themselves to the destruction of the green grass and trees, the respectable population of the central third of the Roman earth.